What if I told you that the first woman in the Bible was not Eve at all, and that the missing name is the reason Genesis feels like it is telling two different creation stories? If you have ever read the opening pages of Scripture and felt that quiet flicker of confusion, you are not imagining it. And tonight, I am opening a cold case that most pulpits will never touch. The question on the file is this: who was Adam's first wife? The terrifying secret of Lilith erased from the Bible. And why does the official record act like she never existed? I am not here to preach at you, and I am not here to sell you a conspiracy. I am here as spiritual FBI, an investigator who treats the text like evidence and who follows the trail wherever it leads. Because in the world you live in right now, in America right now, people argue about power, about gender, about authority, about who gets to speak and who gets rewritten, and that makes this ancient question feel uncomfortably current. Genesis chapter 1 says something simple and massive, that God created man and woman together in the image of God, side by side, in the same breath. Then Genesis chapter 2 slows down and it tells a different sequence. Adam first, and then the woman appears later, formed from his side and brought to him like a divine solution. 2 chapters, 1 book, 1 beginning, and yet the order does not match, and the silence between those lines is not small. It is a gap you can drive a whole myth through. Some believers brush it off as style, some skeptics laugh and move on, but I do not do either, because when a story changes order, an investigator asks why and who benefits from the way it is told. In court, you call it a discrepancy. In theology, you call it a tension. And in the streets, you call it a cover-up. But in the Bible, it is often just a shadow, a pause, a detail that was never meant to be examined too closely. So here's the uncomfortable possibility we are going to test, not as dogma, not as certainty, but as a serious line of inquiry, that there was a woman before Eve, created from the same ground as Adam, equal in origin, equal in dignity, and unwilling to accept a position beneath him. Her name in later Jewish tradition is Lilith, and whether you take her as literal history or as a wording embedded in the cultural memory, her presence explains why the first chapters of Genesis feel like they are stitched together from two perspectives. Think about what that would mean, not for trivia, but for the moral architecture of the story, because the first conflict would not be a bite of fruit, it would be a fight over hierarchy, over the body, over who leads and who yields. If Lilith was the first wife, then Eve is not just the first woman, she becomes the second solution, and that changes the emotional gravity of Eden. And if you are an adult American viewer who has lived through a decade of cultural warfare, you already know how quickly a story becomes a weapon and how fast people erase what threatens the order they prefer. That is why this video exists right now, because the modern world is loud, but it is also forgetful. And the oldest texts are being used as slogans instead of being read like evidence. We are going to do what most people do not do. We are going to slow down. We are going to read Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2 like a forensic report, and we are going to stare directly into the textual gap that everyone else steps around. Along the way, I will make the boundary clear, because some claims about Lilith come from later writings, folklore, and interpretation, and I will name that honestly, because truth does not need exaggeration and faith does not need fear. But I will also make this clear: when a tradition survives for centuries, it usually survives because it touches a nerve. And the nerve Lilith touches is the terror of what happens when the first woman refuses the first man. The story says she leaves, she disappears, and then she returns in the imagination as a presence in the night, as a whisper, as a threat, as the shadow behind forbidden desire. And that is not a random evolution, that is a cultural confession. If this name was erased from the Bible, the deeper question is not only who erased it, the deeper question is what the world is trying to protect itself from by forgetting her. So stay with me, because in the next minutes we are going to reopen Eden, we are going to measure the contradiction, we are going to trace the missing figure, and we are going to end with the question that refuses to die. If Eve was not the first wife, then what happened to the woman who was created first? And why does the silence around her still feel so loud? Lilith does not enter this story as a demon with wings and claws. She enters it as a woman made from the same earth as Adam, standing on the same ground, breathing the same first air, and that detail alone changes everything. If the opening contradiction in Genesis points to a missing figure, then this is where the trail leads, not to a monster, but to a woman who refused to accept a hierarchy written onto her body. In later Jewish tradition, especially in a medieval text known as the Alphabet of Ben Sira, Lilith appears not as folklore, but as an explanation, an answer to a question that the canonical text leaves open, and that answer is deeply uncomfortable. She was formed from dust just like Adam, not taken from his side, not shaped as an addition, but created alongside him, equal in origin, equal in dignity, and equal in will. In a world where order was everything, that equality was not a blessing, it was a threat. The conflict does not begin with hatred, it begins with intimacy, and that is what makes it so explosive. According to the tradition, Adam demands dominance even in the most private act, insisting that Lilith lie beneath him, not as a partner, but as a subordinate, and Lilith refuses, not out of rebellion for its own sake, but because she knows where she came from. She was not taken, she was made, and she will not accept a position that denies her creation. This moment matters because it reframes the fall, not as disobedience to God, but as resistance to imposed hierarchy. And that distinction echoes through every culture shaped by this text. In the ancient patriarchal world, a woman who refused submission was not misunderstood, she was dangerous. This is where the story turns, and where Lilith crosses the line that cannot be uncrossed. She speaks the divine name, the name that tradition says cannot be spoken, not as magic, but as declaration, as proof that she knows her source, and then she leaves Eden. This is not exile, this is departure, and there is a difference. Eden does not expel her, she walks away, choosing isolation over obedience, and in doing so, she becomes something the system cannot control. God sends angels to bring her back, not to destroy her, not yet, but to restore the order that has been broken. They find her, they warn her, they offer her a return, and Lilith refuses. That refusal is the true rupture in the story, because it represents a will that cannot be bent, and ancient systems do not forgive that kind of will. When Lilith will not return, the narrative shifts, and so does her identity. A woman who cannot be controlled must be redefined, not as equal, not as free, but as cursed. This is how myths work. They do not erase what they fear, they transform it into a warning. Lilith moves from the garden to the wilderness, from partner to outsider, from woman to symbol, and the distance grows with every retelling. Notice what happens next, because it follows a pattern we have seen again and again in history. Lilith is no longer described by what she was, but by what she threatens. She becomes associated with the night, with solitude, with unregulated desire, with spaces beyond male authority, and slowly the story hardens. The woman who would not lie beneath Adam becomes the woman who lies in wait, the one blamed for temptation, for disruption, for chaos. This is not accidental, it is psychological, because cultures turn their fears into figures, and then they point to those figures as justification. As an investigator, I want you to see the mechanics at work here, not to accept them blindly, but to recognize them. Lilith is not cursed because she is evil. She is cursed because she would not return to her assigned place. That is the symbolic engine driving this transformation, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. A free woman becomes a forbidden woman, and a forbidden woman becomes a monster. This is the moment where Lilith stops being a person in the story
and becomes a container for everything the system cannot tolerate. By the end of this phase, Lilith is no longer just absent from Eden, she is defined in opposition to it. Eve will soon appear, created differently, placed differently, and accepted differently, and the contrast is intentional. One woman leaves, the other remains. One refuses, the other adapts, and history remembers only one of them as legitimate. Lilith fades from the official record, but she does not disappear from the imagination, and that is where she becomes most powerful. The woman who would not submit becomes the woman who must be feared, and that is how the curse is sealed.
Lilith does not vanish after she leaves Eden. She transforms, slowly at first, then violently, as the imagination of ancient cultures begins to work on a figure that refuses to stay silent. Once she is outside the garden, the story needs a place to put her, and tradition chooses the edge of the world, the Red Sea, not as geography alone, but as symbol, a place of chaos, instability, and untamed depth. In biblical imagination, the sea is never neutral. It is where order dissolves, where boundaries fail, and where monsters are said to rise. And placing Lilith there is not accidental, it is a narrative decision. She is moved from a woman who walked away into a presence that dwells beyond control, beyond law, beyond the reach of Eden itself. Here, the tone of the story darkens, and tragedy gives way to horror. In mystical traditions, Lilith does not live alone in this wilderness. She becomes associated with fallen angels, beings who themselves rejected divine order and who exist in permanent exile. These fallen angels, sometimes described as archons, meaning ruling powers, are not presented as romantic rebels, but as corrupted authorities, and Lilith's alignment with them completes her separation from the created order. The woman who would not submit to Adam is now linked to beings who would not submit to God, and the parallel is deliberate. This is how myth turns defiance into contagion. From this union comes one of the most disturbing claims in ancient folklore, the belief that Lilith gives birth to thousands of demonic offspring every day. This is not meant to be taken as biology, it is symbolic exaggeration, a way of expressing unchecked fertility outside the sanctioned system. In a culture where lineage and inheritance mattered deeply, uncontrolled reproduction was terrifying, and Lilith becomes the embodiment of that fear. Creation outside the garden becomes corruption, birth outside the covenant becomes invasion, and the language shifts accordingly. She is no longer simply outside the order, she is producing what threatens it. This is where the concept of the succubus enters the tradition, the idea of a female demon who visits men in their sleep, drawing life and seed through desire. In later interpretations, the incubus appears as its counterpart, a male demon engaging women, and together they form a framework for explaining desire that escapes social and religious control. Nighttime emissions, erotic dreams, unexplained longing, all are attributed to Lilith and her kind. The body becomes a battlefield, and Lilith becomes the explanation for what happens when desire refuses discipline. This is not random superstition, it is a system of meaning built to contain anxiety. As the myth spreads, Lilith's threat narrows and sharpens, focusing especially on the most vulnerable. She becomes associated with infant death, miscarriage, and danger to women in childbirth. In folklore, she is said to steal newborns, to harm mothers, to hover at the threshold between life and death. These fears are ancient, rooted in a time when childbirth was perilous and infant mortality was high, and Lilith becomes the face of that terror. What cannot be explained medically is explained mythically, and what cannot be controlled is given a name. In response, people do what people have always done when facing unseen threats. They create protection. Amulets are written, charms are hung, and the names of angels are invoked to ward Lilith away. These practices are not marginal, they are widespread, found across Jewish communities for centuries. The irony is striking. because the same tradition that claims Lilith was erased from the sacred text also preserves elaborate rituals to defend against her. Erasure and obsession coexist because fear keeps memory alive, even when doctrine tries to silence it. When you step back and compare Lilith to darker female figures in Mesopotamian culture, the pattern becomes clearer. Figures like Lamashtu and other night spirits share striking similarities. Female beings associated with the wilderness, childbirth, and infant harm. This does not mean Lilith was copied directly, but it shows that the image of a dangerous feminine presence predates and surrounds the biblical world. Lilith becomes the Hebrew expression of a much older anxiety shaped by monotheism but inherited from a broader ancient imagination. At this stage, the transformation is complete. The woman who once stood equal beside Adam has been rewritten as the mother of demons, the queen of the night, the enemy of children, and the whisperer of forbidden desire. This is not a natural evolution, it is a narrative response to a threat that could not be reconciled. A woman who refused hierarchy could not be allowed to remain human in the story, because that would legitimize her choice. So she is pushed beyond humanity, into monstrosity, into mythic darkness.
As an investigator, I want you to feel the weight of this shift, because it is the spine of the fear that surrounds Lilith to this day. The horror is not just that she becomes a demon, the horror is why she becomes one. When a system cannot absorb a challenge, it does not debate it, it demonizes it. Lilith's exile becomes her crime, her independence becomes her corruption, and her fertility becomes her weapon. By the time the myth settles, Eden is safe again. Eve will soon take her place, and the story regains its order. But beyond the garden, in the imagination of the night, Lilith endures, no longer as a woman, but as the embodiment of what happens when the first refusal is never forgiven. Lilith and Eve are never shown standing face to face in the biblical text, yet their conflict runs like a fault line beneath the entire story of creation, quiet, unresolved, and deeply symbolic. Eve enters the narrative as a correction, not to sin, but to instability, formed from Adam's side, placed within a clear structure, and welcomed into an order that already knows its shape. She is not created from the ground, she is derived, connected, and positioned, and that positioning matters more than most readers realize. Eve accepts the framework of Eden, not because she is weak, but because the system rewards her compliance with belonging, protection, and legitimacy. Lilith represents the opposite pole, a model of femininity that cannot be folded into structure, what later thinkers would call uncontrolled feminine energy, a force that exists without permission and without placement. Where Eve is relational, Lilith is autonomous. Where Eve is integrated, Lilith is independent. And where Eve remains within the garden, Lilith chooses the wilderness. This is not simply a moral contrast, it is a political one, because every society depends on regulating reproduction, desire, and inheritance, and Lilith threatens all three at once. The tradition does not need Lilith and Eve to meet physically for the battle to exist, because the battle is conceptual. Eve embodies ordered femininity, motherhood within covenant, sexuality within boundaries, and wisdom gained through consequence. Lilith embodies rejected femininity, desire without sanction, fertility without lineage, and knowledge without permission. One is remembered as the mother of all living, the other as the mother of demons, and that framing tells you exactly which version of womanhood the system chose to preserve. In later folklore, the conflict becomes more explicit, as Lilith is described as watching Eve from the margins, resenting her place, or whispering temptation into the garden. These stories are not uniform and they are not canonical, but they reveal a psychological truth. The fear is not just that Eve might disobey God, the fear is that Eve might remember Lilith. The serpent becomes the bridge in this imagination, a symbol of forbidden knowledge, subtle speech, and disruption of order. And Lilith is often fused with that image, not because the text demands it, but because the symbolism aligns too well to ignore. The serpent offers knowledge without hierarchy.
insight without mediation, and choice without instruction, and those are precisely the qualities associated with Lilith. Whether Lilith is imagined as the serpent itself or as the voice behind it, the association reveals how ancient cultures processed anxiety. Forbidden knowledge is rarely presented as neutral. It is gendered, eroticized, and externalized, and Lilith becomes the shadow cast by Eve's curiosity. When Eve reaches for the fruit, the mythic memory of Lilith lingers, not as fact, but as warning. This is where the idea of dark feminism enters the conversation, not as a modern ideology imposed on an ancient text, but as a descriptive lens. Dark feminism does not mean evil, it means a form of feminine power that exists outside approved channels, power that is not oriented toward nurturing the existing order, but toward exposing its fragility. Lilith is dangerous not because she destroys life, but because she creates life that does not belong to the system, and that is the deepest fear of any structured society. Ancient cultures were not abstract about this fear, they experienced it directly. A woman who did not marry threatened lineage, a woman who did not bear children threatened continuity, and a woman who bore children without legitimacy threatened inheritance. Lilith combines all three anxieties into a single figure, and Eve resolves them by embodying the opposite. Eve's pain in childbirth is framed as consequence, but it is also framed as participation. Her suffering ties her to the future of the order. Lilith's fertility, by contrast, is framed as excess, monstrous, uncontrollable, and therefore hostile. This is the deepest emotional and ideological peak of the story, because it reveals what is really at stake. The war between Lilith and Eve is not about jealousy, it is about which version of womanhood the world can survive. One version fits within walls, laws, and genealogies. The other lives beyond them. One stabilizes the future, the other destabilizes it.
As an investigator, I want you to feel the tension here, because it is not ancient history, it is a recurring pattern. Societies do not only punish disobedience, they mythologize it, turning it into a cautionary tale so powerful that no one wants to follow the same path. Lilith becomes that tale, the woman who refused and paid the price, while Eve becomes the woman who stayed and inherited the earth. By the end of this section, the roles are fixed. Eve stands at the center of the human story, complex, flawed, but accepted. Lilith stands outside it, watching, haunting, remembered only in fragments and fears. The silent war between them never needed a battlefield because it was fought in imagination, in law, and in myth. And once the choice was made, once order selected obedience over autonomy, Lilith could no longer be allowed to exist as merely a woman. She had to become something else, something darker, something that justified her exclusion. This is the moment when the story stops being about Eden and starts being about control, and that is why Lilith remains the most dangerous figure in the shadows of creation. So the question we are left with is not whether Lilith walked the earth as a historical woman, but why her shadow refuses to disappear from the story we tell ourselves about beginnings. After everything we have examined, the contradiction in Genesis, the traditions that fill the silence, the transformation from woman to demon, what remains is not a verdict, but an unease. Because Lilith does not behave like a simple myth invented to entertain, she behaves like a memory that could not be carried forward without consequences. Lilith functions as a symbol for voices that fall outside the approved record, not erased by accident, but set aside because they complicate the order that survives. Sacred histories are not only collections of events, they are systems of meaning, and every system makes choices about what it can tolerate. When a figure threatens the structure itself, the response is rarely debate, it is exclusion. Lilith becomes the emblem of that exclusion, the one who does not fit, the one whose story cannot be integrated without destabilizing the whole. This pattern is not unique to Lilith, and that is where the discomfort deepens. Across religious history, women who embody autonomy,
sexuality, or spiritual authority outside sanctioned roles are frequently demonized. They are recast as temptresses, witches, corrupters, or dangers to the faithful, not necessarily because of what they did, but because of what they represented. Lilith stands at the beginning of that lineage, a prototype for how systems protect themselves by transforming dissent into threat. In the modern world, the language has changed, but the anxiety has not. Societies still struggle with forms of female power that do not align with established expectations, especially when that power intersects with sexuality. Extreme reactions, moral panics, and cultural fear often say more about the system than about the individual being feared. Lilith resonates today not because people secretly believe in demons, but because the questions she raises about control, memory, and authority remain unresolved. This is where the boundary must be stated clearly because precision matters. Lilith is not a figure of official biblical doctrine, and this exploration is not a claim that the Bible hides a secret history in the modern sense. What we are dealing with is cultural theology, the space where interpretation, folklore, and psychology interact with sacred text. Understanding that space does not weaken faith, it strengthens discernment. As an investigator, my role is not to replace belief with suspicion, but to ask why certain stories endure and others do not. Lilith endures because she names a fear that many traditions never fully resolved, the fear of a woman who cannot be placed. She is the embodiment of what happens when order encounters a will it cannot absorb, and rather than adapting, chooses to remember that will as monstrous. Notice what is absent at the end of this story. There is no redemption arc for Lilith, no reconciliation, no return. Silence replaces dialogue, and myth replaces memory. That absence is itself a form of testimony, because stories that are truly insignificant do not require suppression, they simply fade. Lilith did not fade, she transformed, and that tells us something about the power of the question she carries. The question is not whether Lilith was erased by a council or a conspiracy, but whether communities repeatedly chose not to remember her because remembering would force a reckoning. Remembering would mean admitting that the first conflict was not about disobedience to God, but about resistance to hierarchy. It would mean acknowledging that the cost of order has always been exclusion, and that some exclusions are dressed up as moral necessity. So we arrive at the final silence, not as an ending, but as a space for reflection. If a figure can be pushed to the margins of sacred imagination and still refuse to disappear, what does that say about the stories we inherit? And if Lilith is not history, but a mirror, then the reflection it offers is not about demons, it is about us. I will leave you with the only question that truly matters, the one that has driven this entire investigation and will not settle easily. If one woman could be removed from the beginning of the story, transformed into a warning, and remembered only in fear, then how many other truths were lost along the way? And who decides which voices deserve to be remembered? There is no call to action here, no demand for agreement, and no verdict to accept. Only a pause, a quiet moment to consider the weight of forgotten names, and to ask yourself not what you believe about Lilith, but what kind of stories a civilization must tell in order to feel safe.